The next stitch we're going to learn is a satin stitch. This is one that you'll use over and over again. It creates a beautiful flat surface on your embroidery, and I love the look of a satin stitch. That being said, it's a little tricky to get your threads consistently next to each other. And I'll explain what I mean here in just a second. So you're going to bring your stitch up. This is a stitch that you use to fill in an area, and you want to go all the way across the area. This is an example of where we're using the satin stitch in our sampler. So to create the satin stitch, it's just as easy as bringing your stitches up right next to each other, one after the other, to fill in an area with consistent level stitches. Now it's super easy to see it working great on this canvas. And when you're using your embroidery thread, these stitches are gonna stick together because they're not gonna be so far apart, and you're gonna get a nice smooth surface. The reality comes when you get to actual embroidery. So for this sampler, we're using 3 strands of orange to fill in the satin stitch. And we're gonna come and work here on this flower right here. So you want to bring it up, you know, just a couple of threads over from your last stitch. Far enough over that you're making some progress getting your stitching done, but close enough that once you pull your threads through, your stitch is gonna lay flat right next to the other stitch, and you're not gonna see any of your background fabric. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice to get your stitches even and your spacing just right. But I have a couple of tricks for you if you find that you've left a little too much room, or maybe your bottom part was right and your top part wasn't. So the first trick is when you're doing a curved shape, especially like this, and you're keeping your stitches kind of parallel into the center, your middle is going to get tighter faster than your outside. So if I were to keep going with the stitches right here, eventually my stitches aren't going to be pointing into the center of my flower anymore, which is what I want. So in order to make up some of that distance, instead of bringing my stitch and starting it here at the center, the next stitch I'm going to do, I'm going to move up just a tiny bit so that I'm going to hide this with my next stitch, but I'm filling in the top part with this stitch. So then I can come back in and I can go right next to my last full stitch at the bottom, and then come in right next to my partial stitch that I did. And I've covered up where I came in, but now I've filled in that little gap, that little wedge that's going to be created by following my stitches around. Now I'm going to purposely stitch a little too far over and stitch back down. And then I realize, oh, I can see my background fabric underneath there. And that's not what I want. I want a nice smooth surface. It's as easy as just going back in and filling in right between those 2 stitches and filling in that hole. Now, if your hole isn't the whole length, if there's a spot, even filling in that hole, I've left a teeny gap down here. You can come in, cover up that with a stitch, and you can either choose to go all the way up or bury the top of your stitch, or the bottom if you're trying to fill in a hole at the top, and just bury it kind of in the middle, and you'll see that it fills in that hole, but then the stitch just sort of disappears. So that's all there is to a satin stitch. Like I said, it does take a little bit of practice getting your stitches to lay flat next to each other, but the look of this stitch is so beautiful and classic that I couldn't leave it off. So I hope you'll practice on a scrap, and then you'll come and attack your flowers on your sampler, and by the time you're done, you'll be a satin stitch expert. And then we'll move on to our next stitch.